Thanks everybody for coming to our panel, Fake News. National media is failing to tell the right story about jobs. We managed to get 4 journalists that actually would show up for a panel called Fake News. They told me not to go too far into depth with introductions, but I'll just go through quickly our panelists. Hari Srinivasan, anchor, PBS NewsHour. You see him on Christina Amanpour's new show. Scott Cohen, journalist, CNBC. Happy anniversary with them.
Thank you.
Akiko Fujita, who's from Yahoo Finance. And Paul Fain, who says he's the outlier because he's the editor of Inside Higher Ed. But we're going to get into this topic. I'm from Working Nation. Working Nation is a not-for-profit that was set up to tell stories about the future of work and some solutions and how to get people ready and to prepare for whatever's coming. It's funny, today, I just saw this, New Yorker front page, the age of the robot farmers. Picking strawberry takes robot speed, stamina, and skill. Can a robot do it? And it's an interesting starting point for us because we talk a lot about jobs, and oftentimes when we talk about jobs and things like technology, we talk about robots and we talk about these types of jobs, right? Out in the farms and picking and the manufacturing. But we're going to dig in a little bit today about the numbers that are reported monthly, and we all hear them. Not in terms of the politics of it, but more in terms of what do they really mean, what are they lacking, and what can we learn from them, and how can we be better as journalists talking about them. So, Scott, I would love to start off with you talking about the BLS numbers, what they tell us and what they don't tell us.
Sure, and one of the secrets, I think, to getting all of us on a panel entitled Fake News is that I don't think it had a name when I was first. And I do want to say, before I get to that, as someone who is proudly part of this profession for now 40 years, that the name Fake News is unhelpful. It feeds, whether we're trying to be ironic or eye-catching or whatever, it feeds into this narrative that people are putting out information deliberately that's wrong. Right. And I know of no other group more than journalists that sweats out getting it right. Thank you. Having said that, there are things that we don't do well. There's no journalist that's perfect. And a couple of things that we don't do well are nuance, context, adjusting to a changing narrative, and as a result of all of that, we don't do economics as well as we should. And this is what gets to the monthly unemployment numbers. So we just got this on Friday, 3.8% unemployment, 196,000 jobs added, which sounds like an economy that is doing great. So let's pick that apart a little bit. First of all, the unemployment report comes from 2 separate surveys. Not a lot of people necessarily know that. That unemployment rate comes from what's called the household survey, where they're actually going from household to household, finding a sample of people 16 years and older. If you were available for work and you did something to look for work in the past month and you still did not work, you're unemployed. It has nothing to do with unemployment benefits. So that's the unemployment rate. And the number of jobs added, 196,000, is something called the establishment survey, where the Bureau of Labor Statistics is checking with companies in various industries, how many jobs did you add? So that's one of the things that the headline number doesn't tell you. Other things that it doesn't tell you is that there are about 6 million or so people unemployed in the last month, which tells you, okay, there's a problem with jobs, but it also doesn't tell you that there are 7 million job openings or so. So we have this sort of structural issue that I know you deal with a lot at Working Nation, of a skills gap. It should be that everybody that wants a job should have a job, but they don't. And that's something that we don't report because we keep feeding into this narrative of you got to have jobs, you got to have jobs, you got to add jobs. Politicians say this, companies say this. Amazon will go from city to city and ring out all kinds of subsidies because you got to have jobs, but it doesn't talk about the context.
Do you think, Akiko, I'll ask you this, do you think that I won't say it's too complicated, but when we've been going around the country as Working Nation, our emphasis has been, and the reaction that we've been getting is people want to know. They want to know what's really going on, and they definitely know that the number that they're seeing on television does not reflect their life, does not reflect their neighborhood. So why do you think it is that currently this number goes out and it just becomes the number that people use and people don't dig a little bit deeper into it?
Yeah, I think part of it is just that we have a very short attention span in media, and I think that doesn't
fair.
just apply to the labor market, but stories in general. I was just thinking this on Friday when the numbers came out. The entire newsroom was watching at, I think it was 8:30 when the numbers come out. You look at the headline number and you say, okay, great, this is much stronger than it was expected.
Right.
And you look at the wage growth numbers, it wasn't as strong as I think it was 4 cent increase for, on average for an hourly job. And then you move on to the next story on Monday. So you have the whole discussion on Friday. And then I think, you're looking, the next thing you're looking at, what does this mean for the Fed? I think so much of it is also that, when you look at where media outlets are based, they're very much in a bubble in that way. We're on two coasts, Washington, D.C., New York, in California as well. And I think that a lot of the weakness we're seeing in the labor market isn't in those places.
Right.
And so we're not directly, seeing that unless you're out in the field reporting in that way. And I think just given the resources that exist with a lot of media organizations, it doesn't allow us to get out there.
Right. It doesn't, and things like underemployment, and a lot of these conversations are not being had at that level. Hari, when you and I were talking the other day on the phone about this, you used the word numeracy instead of literacy. Is that how you pronounced it?
Yeah, numeracy.
Numeracy.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in this because it's not just the jobs numbers. It's also things like this % growth that can sometimes be skew the story in a way that you don't really mean to, but the audience doesn't really understand the complexity of it.
Right. If you go from 1.5 to 2.0. You can spin that in lots of ways. You can emphasize the 2% and how low that number is, or you can just turn around and say, well, what an amazing growth rate, right? But so if you decide to do those kind of things, you're also realizing that your audience sometimes doesn't have the kind of math savvy that we learned maybe in middle school and then forgot by high school to figure out when we get a piece of information how critical we should be of analyzing it. So again, when you see 200,000 jobs, that is a large number if you're counting like M&Ms in a jar, but it's not that big a number when you think of millions and millions of people that might still be looking for jobs, or millions of jobs, as Scott said, right? So it's really trying to figure out what kind of context your audience has and what kind of numeracy that they have. And most of the times we take that for granted. Well, we're just going to assume, well, here's the sort of easy number. It's the number that everybody kind of agreed on, but nobody really kind of makes sense on. And there's not an emperor has no clothes moment yet where people are like, well, why do you keep telling me that number, right? I mean, like we put on the news hour the Dow Jones Industrial Average every day. Well, that's not the entire market. That's a small basket of companies. But most people, either they learn that at some point and have forgotten it, but it's just a tiny little indicator. We don't go to the Russell 5000. We oftentimes don't even pay attention to the S&P 500. So it's a cross section, right? So again, at some point, we kind of have to keep doing those kind of explainer pieces of journalism to give people a tiny handle on the other stuff that we're reporting.
And I'm curious, I'll ask you, all four of you, whose responsibility is that? How do we do that? How do we start to tell that story to people in a way that's not wonky and doesn't feel like economics? We at Working Nation like to tell it through personal stories and putting a face on a story so that you can really understand. But it might be it might be a question you can't answer. How do we do that? How do we tell our audiences about what's really going on when it comes to the numbers and jobs?
Well, I mean, what you hit on is the best way is to tell these stories through individuals, through personal stories. But first, you got to look for those stories. First, you got to get out of this kind of narrative that we've all grown up with. Unemployment was high, the economy was slow, people need jobs. Well, the economy has changed, the job market has changed, the way we measure the job market has changed. And it's very easy in the just day-to-day grind of a newsroom to say, okay, we'll report this number and we'll move on to the next thing. Or we'll report this number and it means such and such. It means, oh wow, unemployment is low, things must be great. Or the stock market is high, that must mean the economy is good. The stock market is not the economy. The stock market is maybe about expectations or expectations for corporate profits. But that doesn't tell you anything about your personal economy. So it's getting out there and looking and then telling those stories.
Yeah, and I think adding to Scott's point, I mean, or your question, which is whose responsibility is it? I think it it is our responsibility, but a lot of that is in the pitch as well. Because I think if you look at, I mean, I'm at Yahoo Finance now, I was at CNBC before, you look at the direct audience that's watching, a lot of it is very market driven.
Right.
And so I was looking at some of the stories we covered the day the jobs numbers came out. It's about what are the stocks that are going to benefit? What does this mean for the market? What does it mean for the Fed? The reality is, we should be focused on, I think, the workers themselves, and that takes a bit more digging. I think it takes a bit more, me as a reporter sort of crafting that pitch to say this is why it matters, even if it's not about the markets,
Right.
and even if it's not about investors.
That makes a lot of sense.
I think there's also a responsibility, and not to take the focus away from us as journalists, but there's a responsibility for everyone out there that's a stakeholder in all of this to be honest about the debate. To be honest about, okay, it's not just about, again, I'm Amazon, I'm going to come to a city and I'm going to find 50,000 workers in my HQ2, and everybody is going to, well, they couldn't find 50,000 workers in one place. What does that say? And then ultimately, now they're dialing it back and they're just doing 25,000.
Right.
They're having trouble filling those positions. What does that say?
Yeah. Well, it's a good time to bring Paul into the conversation when you say, who are the other stakeholders? And it's interesting, in the last few years, more and more we're hearing educators step into the space of talking about education as connected to jobs. But as you and I talked about the other day on the phone, that was not always the case. When Working Nation first started 4 years ago, it was a very separate conversation. It was, this is how many people we graduate, and everybody should go for a 4-year degree. And it wasn't connected to employment. So I'd love your thoughts on how things have changed.
Yeah, ever since the recession, higher education, the industry I cover, the money and the policy issues on higher education, is being buffeted by the societal forces that are much bigger than higher education, that I think a lot of folks in colleges are reluctantly accepting that they're part of the problem. Well, I shouldn't say they're accepting it, but they're being told that with undeniable data that's new and really troubling, to be honest. And I'll come back to your main point, but as many of you may know, the 30 most selective colleges, which, as it turns out, are the ones that we're all totally obsessed with as a society, Varsity Blues. They enroll more people from the top 1% than the bottom 60% combined, which is just not acceptable. That said, the comprehensive public university, which is 70% of undergrads at 4-year programs, 45% of all undergrads, does very well on social mobility indexes and getting folks from the bottom 2 quartiles to the top. More than half of them do that job well. But we don't talk or think about them, and I think lawmakers and the general public associate Central Missouri State with the elites, and cuts budgets and says college isn't for all, and But I do think since the recession, we as a society are realizing that we have massive gaps between high school, post-secondary, and labor markets. And that wasn't college's problem so much in the past. And community colleges have always cared about jobs, but not in the way that they should now. That it's their responsibility to care about what happens to their graduates after they graduate, and if they don't, policymakers will make them. I think just quickly on whether or not people want to debate the extent of the skills gap or its existence, as some scholars do debate, there's an information gap. Students don't know what's available, what jobs are available, what programs get them there, how much they should cost, how much debt they should take on to get the ROI, and that is a crisis.
It absolutely is. I should have mentioned there's a microphone in the middle. If folks have questions, I'll keep an eye out. Please don't hesitate to come up. But I think this is an interesting point. I'm curious about whether or not colleges, this whole concept of underemployment that we talk about. I don't know how much you report on it on Yahoo Finance, or it's actually talked about. I know, Hari, you've done a lot of pieces for PBS NewsHour and others about higher education. And I'm curious what some of the programs that you've seen over the years doing this, what are the ones that are working, and what's sort of the magic there?
Yeah, so we do about 5 or 10 stories a year on higher ed, and it's thanks in part to the Lumina Foundation. And we do, cover a wide range of kind of what's working. One of the things that sticks out from a few years ago I want to say it's the University of New Hampshire has a program that basically pairs employers directly kind of into the curriculum. And so they create these modules for competency. And what they're saying is, hey, there's these batches of graduates that are coming out of college, but they can't write a single sheet of paper very well. They can't, do the tasks that I need to get done at IBM on a day-to-day basis. So here's the 6 things that I really need. And if you can figure out how to help teach those folks, I will almost guarantee that they will get into my pipeline and do quite well, right? So, but what also seems to be happening is slowly people are realizing that the kind of one-time 4-year degree is not necessarily going to train them for the rest of their lives. There's a very small correlation between what your major is and what it is that you do for a living. And then as people have to shift careers and as people have to think about their life perhaps after 60 and having another job, I think there's really a much more interesting emphasis now on reskilling and rethinking what higher education can be. How can I prepare for this particular task and this particular job at this space versus just coming out with this general credential that might or might not make me a good fit into a specific company.
And Scott, I think it's the 13th annual best, what is it?
America's Top States for Business.
Top States for Business. And you had talked to me about a couple of examples, and I would love for you to give some examples here of what you've seen and what's working, it's tangible.
Well, sure. I mean, and just, so we've done this study, we started it in 2007, that ranks the states for competitiveness, and it started out with that old narrative that we were all used to. What makes a company decide to put so many jobs in this state or that state? And back when we started it out in 2007, it was all about cost of doing business. That was we have a formula for how we decide how we weight the different categories. And everyone was focused on incentives, tax breaks, things like that. Within the last 5 years or so, that's switched like completely to workforce. The state with the best workforce is the state that wins. And so we see states that, and some states, even some of the states that are don't necessarily perform well. I think Mississippi is doing something which Mississippi generally does terrible in the study, but they've adopted this program now where they are trying to match employers with higher education and map out the skills that are needed. And some of these states that are kind of the underdogs, underperforming states, are coming up with ways to do that, and that's a positive. But one of the ways that we look at what's important is what the states are trying to sell, what they're pitching. We go through all of their economic development marketing, and workforce has just become far and away the thing that they're selling the most because that's the battleground now.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, we recently did a short documentary about an apprenticeship that's a fisheries program in Rhode Island. Very small, narrow stories, but it's a personal story. And we try to track what is the outcome of a story. What was remarkable is we heard this week from the program that they now have applicants from every state across the country. People from Hawaii are applying to this apprenticeship for fishing in Rhode Island. There are really wonderful programs, and that's when we talk about media and we talk about journalism. We have the opportunity to tell people that there are these opportunities, there are fields that when we talk about the autonomous vehicle, and I'd love for you guys to jump in here, we also don't talk about, there's a lot of open jobs in driving right now. We don't know when the autonomous vehicle is coming, but then what are we going to do about the drivers? We often just don't take that extra step in terms of the story. I'm curious what you guys have to say about that.
Yeah, I think this is kind of what we talked about when we talked on the phone, that, I think that at least when I look at the coverage at Yahoo, a lot of it is on the technology side of things. So we talk a lot about AI and automation and job losses as a result, but the reality is that's a whole nother industry that's creating jobs. Right. So, I feel like the missing piece of the conversation is, well, what happens to those people whose jobs are replaced by automation, and what's being done to reskill on that end? Right. Yeah. One of the interesting things I found at this conference is sort of this partnership that we're seeing increasingly with companies. Mm-hmm. So with universities and companies. So you've got, obviously, ASU's talked about their partnership with Uber, their partnership with Starbucks. I was listening to a panel today about the partnership that Disney has with another university. And I think that points to the shift that we're seeing in the market right now. So while workers are having to reskill to keep up with the changes, companies are also finding that the skills they're looking for in the market are not there. So it's incumbent on them to have that partnership in place to reskill, so they have the needs that are there. And you know, I feel like that's something that's not being covered a lot.
And you know, there needs to be a little more honesty in the debate, and I think that's something that we in the media can facilitate. So you know, jobs aren't going away because immigrants are taking them.
Right.
Jobs may be going away because of automation. They may be going away for any number of reasons, but we tend to do this sort of two-dimensional debate. Who's taking the job? The jobs are like a constant,
Right.
and you know, who's taking them? Well, the jobs aren't a constant. Everything is changing. Workforce is changing. Skills required are changing. Industries are changing. And you know, things like automation, it's something we can't talk enough about, I don't think.
Right.
Because I think it's just much more the easier narrative on when will you get into a car without a human, right? When will everything happen? And we kind of, because that's an easy future story. It kind of makes everybody think, and you put something like that in your headline, it gets a click. But kind of following through with, well, it also is going to cost X number of thousands of truck drivers possibly their jobs, one of the largest industries that exists in the United States. What happens when 5 million people are somehow displaced from their livelihoods? How do they retrain or reskill? What kinds of work in maybe a supporting category or industry would they have the same wages? And what happens to, you know, maybe there's some positives if they're only driving inside the cities for their 18-wheelers, maybe they get to come home at night, and that means more kids are going to have, you know, their dad or mom there. Okay, that might be an upside, but what about the other, you know, is the long-haul wage replaced equally by doing the kind of city driving? But those are all kind of much more nuanced and complex, and we kind of tend towards the simple, quick, and easy to digest idea.
And
You know, just
yeah, go
real
ahead.
quick to pop in, the jobs that are available, people don't know about or don't want for their kids, and that's partially
Right.
because they have outdated, antiquated views of what these jobs are. I was just hearing here, diesel tech is a huge, high demand field. A lot of the educational providers that did this went out of business. Something like 200,000 openings in the next couple of years. You can get a job for, I don't know, $60K right out of the gate with a short-term certificate. But it's such a crisis that here in California, the community colleges are actually spending money on advertisements to rebrand career education so that people don't think it's just dirty, you know, and even like, you know, drill press operator, you know, diesel tech is tech. And actually you can take that job to a next level job.
Absolutely.
But what's really interesting to make things even bleaker, the really high paying, good ROI short-term certificates go almost entirely to white males. You know, healthcare, women tend to get most of those jobs, do those to the short-term credentials. The IT, construction, so we have gender and ethnic gaps in those professions, and we have an information gap about what the jobs are. But to your point, if you're a post-secondary provider, a college or another type of education provider, you better be talking to employers like they're doing in New Hampshire, because they're going to do it on their own if you don't. And if you all haven't seen Google's IT certificate program, it's fascinating. So it's an 8-month certificate that Google designed. They did it all. It's all online, and you get they're subsidizing it as well. And basically, they have changed the whole industry to use this as an entry-level credential. And now they're going on the back end to have colleges issue it for credit if you want that. So, you know, IT is a first canary in the coal mine, but I think you're seeing the demand is so high that employers are getting into the game themselves.
It was when we were first building out Working Nation, we had the blessing or the curse of building it through a presidential election year. So we were out sort of talking to a lot of people during that process. And one of the things that is the reason for this type of a panel is the conversation that we would see in the media oftentimes, which was, you know, you need a 4-year degree, which, as you just talked about with the credentialing, is not the case necessarily anymore. Not that you should discourage it, but you should be aware of where the jobs are, especially if you want to stay in your region and that type of thing. The jobs numbers and things like manufacturing, it would say across the board, manufacturing is coming back. You know, and we were just having this conversation that even if there is more manufacturing jobs in this country that are going to be created, they're going to be different types of jobs. So this whole concept of lifelong learning and things radically changing, some of the pressure does fall on us as journalists to tell these stories and to let people know, because I sense, I don't know how you all feel, but I sense a lot of people are very confused about what they should do, what their kids should do. We hear that a lot. It's very confusing.
It gets to what we were talking about when we've been talking about how we don't do nuance well.
Right.
We don't do context well, and we don't pick up on new narratives.
Right.
So you certainly saw this during the last presidential campaign, and Lord knows we'll see it in the next. We've got to bring manufacturing back. We've got to bring these jobs back. We've got to bring this plant back. We got to bring coal mining back to West Virginia, which is not happening, folks.
Right, right.
And in the general scheme of things, in terms of industries, it's a very small industry when you compare it to things like renewable energy. But it's not a conversation that we're having because it's not the easy conversation to have. We're accustomed to this same old thing, and I keep talking about Amazon HQ2. Foxconn in Wisconsin is another situation where the state is giving them $4 billion, by far the most that they've ever given a company, to set up shop in a state that doesn't have the workers to populate that plant. They will be drawing a lot of those workers from Illinois. And who's to say that Foxconn couldn't afford to do that? The Amazon situation in New York, there was all sorts of hand-wringing when Amazon pulled out of New York that New York blew it. Well, what if New York had said we're going to spend that $3 billion that we were going to give to Amazon on education or cutting business red tape or something like that?
Right.
And the answer is, well, we didn't have $3 billion to spend. We were going to do that based on the benefit we got from Amazon. Well, what about the benefit that you get from spending on education? But that was not a discussion that we were suited to do. Mm-hmm. And when you tried, and I did try to make that point on the air on CNBC, it's very hard to get it out there. Yeah. It's very hard to get people to talk in nuance and in context.
Mm-hmm. So if the numbers don't end up telling the story, what is the impact on our country? Same question for education. What happens if we continue to put numbers out there and not give it the nuance? I know it's hard, right? I mean, people will read books and there's podcasts, and these types of conferences are fabulous for people to get together and talk. But it is a challenge to get this type of information out to the workers, and then to have education and corporations and not-for-profits react and support change.
Well, I think you have a false narrative, right? If you don't do that. I mean, what's interesting to me is I think oftentimes we in the media don't connect the dots very well. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about, if you want to look at the headline number, jobs market is still very strong, mm-hmm. And yet in the same show, we'll talk about the anger and, what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is saying and the wealth tax and all that. And sure. I think that, that all connects, because what we're seeing is that there's an increasing divide between the top and the bottom. Mm-hmm. And the anger that's out there, whether you agree with the policy or not, is sparked by those people who feel left behind. Right. And so why not connect the dot from there to say, well, who are these people? Right. What is their story? Mm-hmm. Why are they feeling so left out of the broader growth that's happening? And I feel like that's part of the narrative we're not telling too.
Right.
The consequence is that we continue down this path. The consequence, if we just let the numbers tell the story, the numbers do tell a story, but they don't tell the full story. Right. And so that means we keep going down this path. I think, and in defense of us, these are tough stories to tell.
Oh, yeah.
In a minute 30 or in 2,000 words or whatever. They're hard stories to tell. And so one of the things that has to be part of this discussion is media literacy, is that people need to be seeking out this information. We can't spoon feed them everything. We can't. Right. So if it's just if you're just going to get all of your information from CNBC or the NewsHour or Yahoo or higher ed, inside higher ed, you're not going to get the full story unless you really look for it. And people need to know how to consume media. That's key, and it's probably beyond this panel, but
Yeah, there's a
that's
responsibility.
That's a huge problem.
Yeah, and in fairness, I didn't give it the title. Someone at the ASU did. But, you know, when talking about the jobs numbers, we can talk about it doesn't tell the full story. When talking about things that we've all heard about in fake news and things that are shared on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, in a lot of cases, it is the responsibility of the person that is getting a hold of that information, whether or not they choose to research it before they share it out to the world and say this is true, when maybe it was a story from 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Yeah, speaking of fact checks, I fact checked myself. It's Southern New Hampshire University, not University of New Hampshire. Sorry.
See? But you got it right.
But now I do. It's Paul LeBlanc. If you type in LeBlanc and Srinivasan,
He's here.
It'll be the only story. So Paul, if you're here, I'm very sorry. So.
I'm curious about this too, because we've talked to a couple of not-for-profit companies here, and one of the things we talk about at Working Nation is we're not shying away from the fact that this is a consumer-driven country. We are okay with the fact that companies are making decisions for the good of their company. Oftentimes, we see that means layoffs. But behind the scenes, there's also great reskilling programs within some of these companies. And what we're hearing from CEOs and others is, well, you just do the headline of, 10,000 laid off or 1,000 people laid off. You're not telling the story about the reskilling. I'm curious from your perspective, and from our perspective, we keep saying, well, that's a harder story to tell. And like you said, you can't do that in 15 seconds. They had a layoff. But when companies decide to put the money into reskilling their workers, it is for the good of their company. It is for the good of this country because we're consumer driven. We need people to buy the goods and services. We need people to be working and be an active member of the middle class. So I'm curious, when you think about it from a company perspective, what would drive them to get involved in this conversation in a different way and kind of get the information out there more about reskilling and what's really happening with underemployment in the middle class?
Are they shying away from it? I mean, I don't know, and I guess that speaks to the problem. We haven't done the story. But
Yeah.
Are they don't want to talk about their reskilling because they don't want to call attention to the fact that 10,000 people were laid off?
I think that what we've heard is that they do feel there's a lot of gotcha journalism, that it's the quick in and out. And when you want to talk to them about, okay, what are you really doing for your workforce? Also, we've heard from certain companies, it's very scary. We're moving into an environment where we might need a big percentage less employees than we do right now. How do we tell that story? And how do we tell our environment or our community that they really need to get reskilled?
I think transparency is a good policy for most companies. I mean, unless you're working in the CIA, I guess otherwise it's really important. And most companies that have started in the last few years, perhaps it's because they're from a younger workforce or they're startups, they have, all company alls where everybody kind of has a Q&A session, any member of the staff anywhere, but even on the sort of factory floor level, right? But I think some of that is cultural. If you've been a company that's done things a certain way for 50 years, it's really hard for the upper management to realize that there's a benefit in actually just answering questions once a week versus letting rumors fester and grow and possibly, upsetting your culture and decreasing your productivity. So that's a hard conversation just culturally for them to accept, that maybe I should change the way I do things and how I communicate with my employees. But it also actually engenders a greater amount of trust in the community that they live in if people have some certainty and say, okay, this job is safe, this job needs to be reskilled, or I'm not going to be able to work there, but at least this person's being upfront with me and telling me, hey, I have this program. If you work on this for the next couple of years, you're going to be okay. I can continue to employ you. Otherwise, we're going to have this sort of secret buildup to a hard hatchet, and you have to go home and explain to your family why you're not working anymore.
I feel like until 2 years ago, whenever I would go talk to like the U.S. Chamber, the panels often were, higher ed just doesn't get it, it's broken. Or this event, a few years ago, the colleges they're so stuck in the past and they don't get it. That tone has changed. I'm hearing a lot more, employers have to step up. We're part of the problem. We don't really, besides, meeting with local colleges in kind of a not a meaningful way, that's all we've done. And we have to change, we have to get involved. And, I had this press release come over the Transom the other day. JP Morgan is spending $600 million on community college and career training programs. That's a lot of money. That's like a quarter of what the federal government spent under Obama on similar grants. And at the same time, they actually just stopped doing campus visits for their investment bank recruiting. They're going to start doing it with online assessments. So I mean, that's a big change for a company like that, and we're paying attention now.
And Google no longer sorts by your college degree, right? And other tech companies, that's not one of the automatic filters that throws your resume out.
I do think that we in the media need to be honest with ourselves about, if they fear that there's gotcha journalism, and there is some gotcha journalism out there. There is, again, with the narratives that we always fall back on because they're comfortable. Big business is bad. Blue collar workers are good, and there's no middle ground. The fact is that there are a lot of these stories, and we should be telling them. And I guess part of the answer is to get out of this sort of catch-22 is to tell the stories and not turn it into a gotcha, and not let our editors tell us to turn it into a gotcha. I mean, it's less of an issue, I think, in business news because we're looking at more of some of the pro-business arguments and things and that type of thing. But I think in general, there does need to be a little more open-mindedness on the part of reporters, all of whom are working under all kinds of pressures, whether it's crank out this many stories and tweet about this and Instagram about that. We have a lot of things on our plate, but we do need to get back to some of the basics of just tell the story.
Thoughts? Any questions? I want to thank our panel so much for the time, and we'll be around for any questions afterwards. So thank you.